bring
very
this
quickly,
pretty
right?
girl out to a ranch where there's no women around.
Right.
She's the only one, you know. I mean, Brad Pitt alludes to the fact that there probably is women around just based off the things he says, but you don't really see any. They seem like they're out in the middle of nowhere.
I also don't get how these, like, it's kind of a dirtbag move by both of the older brothers, right? Like,
Yeah.
To just be like already hitting on her.
She is engaged to their youngest brother.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, Alf.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Real Stakes podcast, getting down to the meat of movies. We are here to tear apart some movies and look at the themes, not just the special effects, not just the love and the glamour of the actors and actresses in it, but instead really talk about what these movies are about, what they are pushing as far as story, thematics, philosophy, things of that nature, and then maybe pepper in some trivia and fun facts and definitely some entertaining jokes along the way. My name is Jesse Mayer. Welcome to the pod, and my wonderful co-hosts, obviously, Mr. Zach Peak.
Hey there.
And Chase Nelson.
Hey.
So we are, if you clicked on this, it's my favorite joke, you already know what we're reviewing. We are doing Legends of the Fall from 1996, I believe, is when this movie came out, starring Brad Pitt.
Sir Anthony Hopkins.
Sir Anthony Hopkins. Yep. Have I ever told you guys that I've always wanted to be knighted?
I'll knight
think
you.
I've
Can we
told
knight
Zach.
each other?
I'll knight you.
Yeah. That would
Can
be
we-
great.
'cause
Me and Zach
we're-
are lords, so maybe
Yes.
we just need to get
Jesse and I
Chase on
technically
the
own land in
lords.
Scotland, so he and I are both lords.
Well,
so I feel
our
like I
lord.
could knight you.
I'll have to postpone this. I'm going to learn how to make a sword with Wade in
With
his
Wade.
forge. Yeah, and then
And the
I'll knight
blacksmith.
you with my crooked sword.
Perfect. I love this. Anyways, Sir Anthony Hopkins is also in it. We also have Julia Ormond, and then a few other actors that I don't know that I've seen in anything else outside of this, and if I have, it has lost to the world.
Yeah,
it is. Let's kind of just talk through for you, those of you who maybe haven't seen it in a really long time, or those of you who just want to hear our hot takes on a movie you've never seen. We will be spoiling it, but here is the general breakdown of the movie. Basically, what happens is we're introduced to the Ludlow family. Has three brothers, a father, and a mother who is very, very absent. She still writes them, but is basically not living with them. They live on a ranch in Montana. And the youngest brother basically at one point brings home a fiance. And then around that same time is when we are going into the First World War.
Yep.
1915, yep.
1915. And the brothers decide it is their civic duty to go and serve in the war. So they actually enlist in the Canadian Army
Yep.
to go fight in the war because America was not involved at this point. While they're out there, the youngest brother dies tragically fighting in the war, while the middle brother, Tristan, who is kind of the
He's a protagonist.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
the
oh,
protagonist,
he was the
and he's
wild,
also
yeah.
kind of the wild brother. So the oldest brother is I follow all the rules. I don't
Yep.
remember his name.
Classic firstborn.
Alfred.
Yes.
Alfred.
So obviously I relate a lot to Alfred because I'm a firstborn. Zach's a firstborn. Are you?
Yeah, but
Chase,
I don't
what are
relate
you?
to him.
Chase, what are you? What's your
I'm
I do
first.
not.
You're
I do not
first?
relate to him at all at this point. Maybe when I was in high school, but at this point, it's been a
Not
little
the
bit.
same?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just no. I do
I'm
not.
just the rule follower of the group. We'll
Yep.
figure out where everybody else lays out. Anyways, Alfred, classic rule follower. Then Tristan, the middle brother, is kind of the wild one. Your first introduction to him is he shows up late to the train station to help pick up the fiance, and he's riding a horse and looking dashing because he's Brad Pitt, and he's just like the hunk and the wild man. If this was filmed later, as far as like if this was taking place in the 50s, he would have pulled up 50s or 60s. He would have pulled up on a motorcycle instead of a horse.
Oh, yeah,
that's
for
the
sure.
bad boy vibe.
For sure.
Kind of gives off. And then there's the youngest brother who they feel like they always have to protect. So
Yeah.
Tristan watches his youngest brother gets murdered in the war. When they come back, obviously the fiance has been waiting for the youngest brother to come back. He doesn't, and Alfred and Tristan both start making moves on her, and ultimately she ends up with Tristan for a while. Then he has what would you call it? A complex over the loss
I think
of the
at this
brother.
point, yeah, like we can keep going a little bit, but also like this movie is it's about everything that happens afterwards. It's not it's not
the
about
results
Samuel.
of the
It's just
inciting incident.
And what's interesting is a lot of stories that we talk about, a lot of stories that we have today, and I think this is a good thing. They kind of have a message. They kind of have a theme or a moral, or they want you to take away something from watching the movie. But this movie is a little bit more like Dune. And Dune is great. It's one of our favorite. All three of us, we love Dune. We've all read the book. It was awesome. We're so excited for the next movie.
There's a great Dune podcast coming out. When
there
the next
will
movie
be.
comes out.
It will be like 4, 5, 6 hours. Who knows? But we love Dune, and this is similar to Dune in that it's not really trying to give you a message. It's not really trying to tell a story to tell you something. It explores just so many different things. It explores Tristan's guilt. It explores his impulsiveness and wildness. It explores the youngest brother's fiance, who eventually becomes involved with both of the other brothers, like her path and her decisions. It shows the oldest brother as his decision making. It just kind of tells a story about it's a story about so many different things, actions and consequences. And there's anti-government rants in it, and there's naive idealists in it, and there's just so much, and that's what's really cool about it. And that's why I think it's really good, is because it's about so many different things. It's hard to just put it into a synopsis.
Yeah, and I mean, very much this is almost a prodigal son story. I mean, Legends of the Fall is actually a reference to the biblical fall of Innocence. And we really see that throughout this. After they go off to war and the youngest brother dies, everything kind of shatters for everyone. Like Alfred deals with, well, you should have protected him, and I have this love concern or love interest, and Tristan's dealing with, I should have protected him, and I am in love with this woman, but I'm also dealing with all this guilt, and he abandoned her. Like, there's just this loss of innocence all across the board, and it's basically the story of how they deal with those various consequences once their innocence is lost. Yeah. And so, like you said, Tristan runs off. He basically goes off and literally does the prodigal son thing. Like, he goes and spends his time traveling, and he's with concubines and prostitutes at one point, and then he eventually does come home and
killing like everything on the planet.
Yeah, he's like a great hunter. There's a whole montage of him being off, and his his wife now waiting for him, and just him never coming back, never writing her. And then when he finally does, she's moved on to the older brother because he told her, "I'm basically dead. You should move on."
I believe his letter is pretty short. I think it says, "All is dead as I am dead. Find another."
Yeah. No, it's all that we had is dead. As I am dead, marry another. Like, that's right. It.
Yeah. So it's very short, but when he does return, you do see that prodigal son moment. Anthony Hopkins is rejoicing at him returning. I mean, it's very embellished because he's literally like funneling almost 20 horses into a corral by himself, which, as somebody who used to do that, is probably the most ridiculous part of this movie.
In a three-piece suit with his long hair flowing.
Yes, and he fights a bear in this, and I'm saying that is the most ridiculous part of this movie. Twice he fights a bear. And so there's a whole prodigal son thing, him dealing with the consequences of having left and dealing with the fact that he missed his father having a stroke. And Anthony Hopkins playing a stroke victim and being this like anti-government cowboy is amazing.
Stroked out Anthony Hopkins in bear jacket is like my spirit animal.
It's your spirit animal. So he's dealing with that. He's dealing with she's moved on and loved another. There's another love interest that presents a girl that he grew up with, and there's a second basically loss of innocence where she is murdered along with being beaten by police officers and him having to decide how to punish the people that killed her. And so there's just a lot of story beats in this that are really just dealing with action and consequence, innocence, and then dealing with the lack of innocence afterwards, seeing the world through different lenses once that pretty pane of glass has been shattered, right?
Yeah.
And so what were your initial takes on this story? Chase, I want to kind of hear from you. We kind of heard from Zach. He talked about this is more of a less like here's big philosophy and more of just this is trying to replicate real life as far as what might happen if you were dealing with these things.
Yeah, no. So this is like one of my favorite movies. So '96. I never saw this like when it came out. I was still pretty young, but what introduced me to this movie was I was deployed in Iraq, and some of my buddies I was living with brought it up, and I was like, I've never seen that. I remember being a kid and seeing what we're seeing down here, the VHS cover of it, and it's like Brad Pitt with his long hair. I think that actually the VHS cover is a little different than that, and it's like Brad Pitt and his long hair, and I'm like, romance novel, like no interest, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm around all these like testosterone infused Marines, and they're like, you haven't seen Legends of the Fall? It's so good. I was like, no. Not interested. And they're like, you gotta watch. And so we like at some point we got a copy and we watched it, and I was like, okay, this movie is pretty sweet. Like, it's just kind of this long drawn out epic. It is like a tragic story, but just the setting and the character, like Anthony Hopkins and Brad Pitt are awesome in this. And I don't know, I always liked it, and it has, like, for me, it has some cool themes in it that you can kind of, as I've watched it more over the years, let's see how you pronounce it. There's like a really cool like agorism theme, which is kind of like anarchy. Like you get Anthony Hopkins' character, and just kind of the way they operate. And like agorism is more of like operating in the constraints of society, but kind of like being self-sufficient and doing as much as you can outside of society, like self-sustainment. And there's all these laws and things in society, whether they're moral or not, and you kind of see these things play out with how they kind of subvert authority a little bit, but in a way that kind of makes you respect them. Like, he has his ranch hand, and you don't know much about him. He's married the Indian guy's daughter, so an Indian woman, and these like the sheriff and this like random like Irish crony show up like looking for him. They're like, have you seen it? And he kind of tips his hat down and he walks off, and they come up to Anthony Hopkins, like, have you seen this man? He's wanted. And right away Anthony Hopkins is like, yeah, I saw him. He came through here a few months ago, and I think he was going to Hong Kong. And they're like, oh. And he's like, what's he wanted for? And you kind of get the idea he probably already knows. He just wants to see what they're going to say. And you go, well, it's a private matter. And he's like, well, that's a public office you hold. And then he just leaves. And it's just like stuff like that. And he's got a lot of great rants. And, by the end, they're kind of like moonshining during Prohibition.
Smuggling
and which, the Volstead Act, and the oldest son helps pass the Volstead Act. Mm-hmm. But his buddy is this Irish guy who they're kind of have like, it's like cronyism. Like, they're writing these laws like government often does to help, some other people over others. And so they're running this illegal liquor business, and then Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins are like, oh, we'll make liquor and sell it. And then it kind of culminates in this climax of violence at the end.
Which actually kills Brad Pitt's.
Which actually kills his wife.
His wife, yeah. Right? Because he doesn't marry the first love interest, but
yeah.
And
yeah, just there is a strong kind of anti-war message in what I feel like is a good way, because Anthony Hopkins is the main driver of that. He's seen his sons be caught up in a conflict that doesn't have much to do with them, especially at the time the U.S. isn't in war yet.
And Anthony's experienced war before.
And he's they show a clip of him. He kind of goes on at some point later when his son's asking for his blessing for office, and he's like, I know what war is. He's like, the issues back then were Indians, and they do a clip, and it shows him, he was kind of responsible for being in the military when they were pushing the Native Americans out of their land, and there's a lot of bloodshed, and he talks about the tragedy of life lost, of like innocent people too. And so he's lecturing his sons about that, and you watch them kind of go off, and they're enthralled with what's going on in the world and wanting to be a part of it. But you kind of see the tragedy in it when they're done. Brad Pitt's character basically goes along just to protect his younger brother, which is kind of comical. As someone who was in the military, watching the funny things where he's like, doesn't really even care about anything. His brother's like, get back with the enlistment. He's like, no, I'm going to stay here with you.
I'm just doing my own thing.
And yeah, I've never been in trench warfare. It seemed a little more chaotic and less orderly, but yeah, and it's just interesting. I like these themes. It's one of the reasons I like the movie, even though it's so tragic. There's still interesting things kind of throughout it.
it's a very human experience, right? Like we see a human element play out that doesn't feel as scripted as maybe some of the more modern takes on it. I mean, you know, you give or take on Brad Pitt's crying/screaming skills. Which,
terrible crier.
Which
He was I started laughing when he cried.
I watched this with my girlfriend. And I'm like, I can't tell if this is so bad it's looping back around into the good realm, or if it's just so bad I can't stop laughing. But I mean, you give or take on Brad's dramatic moment acting, it is ultimately a story written very much about human experiences and dealing with consequences. What were your takes on this, Zach?
I thought it was a great take on the classic Greek tragedy story. There's elements of fate that they bring in through the Native American culture, which I thought was done well. I thought it was interesting. One thing that I liked about bringing the Native American culture into it is you have this old Native American guy who kind of narrates this beginning and ends of the story, and his just take on things and like his morality is very different. And it's not necessarily bad, and the movie is not there to judge the morality, but, you know, like at the very end, Tristan, who is the protagonist, it's Brad Pitt's character, dies fighting a bear, you know, and the guy's like, it was a good death.
Yeah.
So,
it's like, was it though?
well, and what's interesting too is, so this movie was originally kind of written as a movie that it was conceived as a movie that was supposed to star Sean Connery, Sir Sean Connery, sorry, another Sir,
okay,
and Tom Cruise. So
wow, all right, tell me more.
Here's a wild take, though. That phrase, "It was a good death," is also the last phrase spoken in The Last Samurai, which does star Tom
by
Cruise.
Ken Watanabe.
Okay.
Yes,
okay,
Ken Watanabe, and so very similar, right? Because we also see that in The Last Samurai, there's a very serious parallel of Native Americans and their loss. And, you know, an American military guy, and we see that in the Japanese and American military thing as well. So is very interesting that basically both movies could have.
So Sean Connery was going to be Colonel Ludlow.
Yes, Sean Connery would have been Colonel Ludlow.
I feel like he could have pulled it off.
So Tom Cruise going to grow out his hair long?
He would have had to. The other person that was offered this role before they gave it to Brad Pitt was Johnny Depp. And what a way different movie this would have been with Johnny Depp.
Right? Wouldn't have hit the
you
same.
know, as bad as his ugly crying was, which I would recommend anybody watch just because the humor is off the charts. But as you know, as bad as that part was, it's just one small part of, you know, a 2-hour movie. And I thought he did a really good job in the role. I thought he did a good job, and it was a difficult role in some ways, I think, because it was a twist on the Greek tragedy, because it's a Greek tragedy. It's a tragic story. Like, a lot of people you like die. a lot of people that come up to be good guys end up dead. And it's a lot of pain, a lot of sadness, a lot of heartbreak. There's a suicide in it, which we haven't talked about yet, of one of the main characters, you know? So it's, but what was interesting, and it says so at the very end of the movie, so it's not super subtle about it, but a Greek tragedy with a tragic hero, you know, they are fated to go down a path that will end in downfall, you know, and he does. Brad Pitt's character Tristan does a little bit, but as it says in the movie, instead of him dying young, he is the rock that others are shattered upon. You know, his actions hurt his father, hurts his older brother. I feel like, you know, he feels guilt over his younger brother, although that's not really his fault. It ends with a suicide of the woman that he loved, and then ends up being his brother's wife. It ends with the death of his wife. It ends with him not being able to raise his children. It's pretty.
And I mean, the scene before. So at 2 points in this movie, the character Tristan fights a bear. So at the very beginning, he fights this bear. The bear's name, Bart the Bear.
Bart the Bear.
Bart the Bear.
Yeah, he was an actor.
What other movies has he been in?
So actually, weirdly enough,
Great Outdoors.
I did not look up his IMDb profile, but
I hope he has one.
Actually, I would have no doubt. But Anthony Hopkins actually played in another movie with Bart the Bear later.
Oh, is it that?
The Edge.
Yeah,
in the 1999.
Edge,
So
So-
Bart the Bear and Anthony Hopkins, BFFs.
Should we do, like a power ranking of actor duos and just Anthony Hopkins and Bart the Bear at the top?
best. Yes, absolutely.
Considering they're in 2 movies.
So, I mean, during those two scenes, you know, that kind of starts the movie and ends the movie, as well as the Native American man narrating. But you see all these tombstones at the very end of the movie of people that have died before you see him finally die.
I think Samuel's is the first, and then as the movie goes, there's more.
Yes, and those gravestones just start filling in.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, his older brother, it's his younger brother, it's his dad, it's his mom, it's the first love interest. I can't remember her name right now.
Susanna.
Susanna, played by Julia Ormond.
Yeah.
And they all are dead, and finally this bear that's basically been tracking him, or they've encountered each other multiple times throughout their lives, finally does kill him. And so it's just interesting because, that idea of this rock that everyone else breaks against, of his choices and his life, are these things that almost always adversely affect other people's lives.
Yeah. And I like that it was one element of the Greek tragedy is that it's fated. The decisions the characters make aren't necessarily good or bad decisions. They're not right or wrong decisions, but they just kind of end up there. While in this story, it's pretty clearly his bad decisions.
Right.
His impulse, he's very impulsive. He's a wild warrior, and he just does whatever he wants. He's not very considerate of others. And how does that end up? A lot of people are hurt because of it. And I really liked that twist because the Greeks believed, their philosophical idea was that everything is fated. And so it doesn't really matter what you do or what you don't do or what decision you make. It's like, it's just fate. You're going to end up where the gods push you no matter what. While this is like, well, you can still make bad decisions. And he makes a lot of bad decisions, and they do a great job of making him sympathetic because it's out of guilt. He's in a deep amount of pain over losing his brother because, like Chase said earlier, Tristan goes to the war purely to take care of his little brother, purely to make sure his little brother survives. And he puts himself in harm's way. He exposes himself to danger just to save his brother. And then he fails. And it's through no fault of his own. He did everything he could, and it just didn't go his way.
And he collects German scalps.
And then, and then he goes crazy and starts scalping Germans. It's kind of a cool scene. But
and then he rips his brother's heart out and mails it home.
Yeah, it's endearing. But my point is, through all that, it causes this shattering guilt, which really, kind of is the impetus for so many of his decisions. It's why he doesn't stay with the woman he loves first.
Susanna.
Yeah, it's why he doesn't stay with Susanna. It's why he leaves and the ranch goes into disrepair. It's part of the reason why his older brother goes off, is because without him there to help, mediate, his oldest brother and his father kind of grow apart and fight a little bit more. It causes Susanna to go marry the older brother, and then eventually he comes back and it rips her apart, so she commits suicide. It's like a lot of these bad things happen because he makes these bad choices, but they're out of guilt. And so you're very sympathetic to it because you're not like, oh man, why do you keep making bad decisions? It's because these difficult things happen to him and he responds poorly, but you also feel for him. I thought they did a really great job of bringing that together. So you stick with him as a protagonist, even though he makes a lot of bad choices, and you're rooting for him and want good things, but you see how he keeps falling into this pattern. And it's like, they did a great job of building that story up and showing us all these things through that lens.
So I think it's really interesting. I kind of want to talk about the storyline with him and Susanna. So I initially start laughing at the beginning of this movie. As soon as she steps off the train, all three brothers are obviously very, very interested in this woman, right? And at first I kind of chalk it up to, okay, well, they're living out in the quote-unquote middle of Montana, probably haven't seen another woman, especially one as refined and probably well put together as this in a very long time. But like, the trap is very real of like, oh, this is a love quadrangle coming.
Well, you bring this
quickly,
pretty
right?
girl out to a ranch where there's no women around.
Right.
She's the only one, I mean, Brad Pitt alludes to the fact that there probably is women around just based off the things he says, but you don't really see any. They seem like they're out in the middle of nowhere.
I also don't get how these, like, it's kind of a dirtbag move by both of the older brothers, right? Like,
to just be like already hitting on her.
She is engaged to their youngest brother. Yeah. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, Alfred at the beginning is a little more like, he's just like, did you see Swiss Family Robinson?
Yes.
Yeah. Remember when they find out that the boy they're helping is actually a girl, and then they start being like overly like
helpful,
assisting.
and
Like that's kind of Alfred.
And then
But then
Brad's just
and then
like
and then
full on.
Brad Pitt's like, well, he doesn't. He just kind of they all like look at her with that kind of like, wow, look,
Right.
But then, but she kind of initiates it.
Yeah,
She's having a hard time because Samuel announces he's going to join the war, and then Alfred's like, and I'm going too, and she's having a hard time, and Tristan's there. I forget who's in. I think he's in there, and she comes in, or vice versa. But she kind of like leans into him, but he doesn't really do the noble thing of like putting space. He kind of like, I mean, like he's comforting her, but then it's like the faces linger really close. And then Alfred walks up and sees them.
And catches them. So the actress who plays Susanna, before we continue this, Julia Ormond, another person that was supposed to theoretically take that role was Gwyneth Paltrow, actually. Which, again, a very different movie probably. I think she could have pulled it off, but it would have been a very different movie.
Can we take like 2 minutes? I'm young, that don't know anything. Don't know any like big Gwyneth Paltrow besides Pepper Potts in the Marvel movies. So like, what was the take on Gwyneth Paltrow before like the Marvel movies? Would that have been good? Would that have been bad?
As far as like, would other roles have?
Like, was there anything else that you saw her in, or that you like? Do you have any idea what the
I know she was around.
She was around, but I can't
remember
think
what
of
she
it off
was
the
in.
top of my head. I think that was probably her largest starring role that I can think of was the Marvel.
She wasn't saying
Enterprise.
Shakespeare in Love, which I still need to see because I do love rom-coms.
So it's just interesting because that could have been a different thing. I was doing some Googling of trivia before this. Brad Pitt and Julia apparently lived in the same house. So this was all shot in Calgary, not in Montana.
Okay.
They shot this in Canada because it saved them $2 million on production cost to do so.
Yeah, that was great.
And while they were up there, they actually lived in the house together. And apparently Brad quotes it as, "It did help build the sexual tension." That was the only phrase he had on this, right? But what I think is interesting is I think she plays, if you look at her character, Julia's character, Susanna, objectively, you're like, why are you still on this ranch? Even past when the little brother dies, why are you still waiting?
I think they kind of allude to it at one point. Just there's mention that her home life before meeting Samuel was not.
I think she lost both her parents, right?
They don't really say specifically, but it's something like that, right?
But and I agree with that. Like they say that at the very beginning, like in the letter that the absent mom writes to the father. She says she lost her parents or something along those lines.
So she didn't really have anywhere else to go.
She says something about like she's kind of a sad person or like something to that effect. Like
she's worried about her being fragile.
Yeah,
I think something. But I'm also like, this chick is really, her character to me, like the older brother makes sense. He's very firstborn, rule followy. He gets mad when Tristan and Susanna kind of get together but aren't married, and then Tristan leaves for a few years and she's waiting for him and he kind of calls her out like, dude, he's being a loser. He's being terrible, and fights with his father because he's saying bad things about Tristan. So like he's very rule followy and all kind of that, very cultured and in the city and the civilized. Tristan's the wild man and like his decisions are impulsive and that makes sense. The youngest brother is this idealist and goes to the war because of it.
He's the pure one. He's like innocent.
The Anthony
Literal
Hopkins.
loss of innocence in the war.
Yeah, but Anthony Hopkins is this war weary vet, just weathered and everything, and he's just done with all of it, wants to live this quiet life on a ranch. Like all those characters make sense to me. And then Susanna to me is just kind of like all over the place.
She's the, if you understand this reference, she's the Jenny of this movie.
I do understand.
People,
I'm not that young.
Forrest Gump Jenny, which people have come to the conclusion much later now that Jenny is the bad guy. Like she's not a good person, and in many ways, Susanna is
she's
very
the
similar.
original toxic woman.
Yeah, and Susanna is kind of like, I mean, the Indian guy narrates this well when he says like she's the ice that freezes in a rock and breaks it apart by no fault of hers. But when you watch it, I mean,
well, and you
can kind of falter.
And I mean, you could put it towards, women had limited choices back then, so like getting married, whereas her best option, so she was trying to wait for an opportunity. But I think,
or you could blame, Samuel for bringing her home around Brad Pitt.
Yeah. You know how good looking your brother is. You don't bring her home until you got a ring on it.
Yeah.
No women around Brad Pitt. That's just a bad idea.
Yeah. And so, I mean, her character, I think, was the one that didn't make the most sense. Like, Isabella, too, basically, I mean, she's a woman who knows what she wants. She says, I'm going to marry Tristan at a young age and has like a 10-year gap on him. But she goes out and does it, right? And it's like she wasn't sitting around waiting for him. But when he came back, she basically was like, all right, are we doing this or not? But Susanna was basically like, she just sort of waited for things to happen to her. She never took the initiative other than occasionally taking the initiative to potentially cheat on her fiance with Brett.
Quick question.
And her husband, because later after Isabel 2 dies, she visits him in jail and like thinks now that his wife is dead, maybe they could rekindle it.
Yeah, she's all over the place. Yep. What relationship do we see between Isabel 2 and Tristan? I don't really remember. I know that when Tristan's going off and doing stuff, Isabel 2 is like, I'm going to marry him someday. But when Tristan gets back, what relationship scenes do we have between them?
As far as before they get married?
Yeah. Do we have any?
I mean, it's really only that one barn scene where he's basically a
but they do show them kind of start like...
There's a little montage of like them.
Yeah, they're sitting together. And you do see, if you juxtapose it with the scenes with Susanna, like he's obviously attracted to her, but when you see them in scenes, he doesn't like look at her. They're sitting there. And
talking about Isabel?
I'm talking about Susanna.
Susanna, right.
She's kind of talking to him and he's like zoned, and it's like kind of this facade. And then when you look at the scenes when he comes back and then his relationship with Isabel 2 starts, you see them sitting and he's sitting there looking at her and they're talking, because you see him really when he comes back from that long hiatus, he kind of rides up and you see it in his face, like he's kind of gotten through
when
a lot of
he herds 30 horses by himself into a corral, which is the most unrealistic portion of this movie.
Yeah, but that's how he makes his entry, right? But you kind of see there's been some healing for him. He's kind of lost a lot of the burden. He's made peace with what was bothering him before, the guilt and the shame, and he's ready to move on. And then I think it's shown well through that, because now he's, what does Alfred say to him about Susanna before he leaves?
He's like, "Are you going to marry her?"
You can't. You can't make her happy because he's full of chaos. The Indian guy constantly refers to him as like the bear, like because the movie starts with him at a young age getting injured because he encountered the bear and like stabbed it and fought it
or cut the toe off.
Yeah, like cut the toe off, but he survives, and so the Indian guy you kind of get this idea like he has the spirit of the bear in him, and everything he's doing is like. He always refers to it as it was the bear, like all these like chaotic actions he's taking. And when he comes back, he says, I think he said something like the bear was sleeping in him or something. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think they kind of show that in the little few scenes.
Yeah. Well, that's fair, but I do think then it's tough, because I look at that as him leaving her, because he's gone for years. He's like, I'll be gone in a couple months. And it's like 5-6 years.
Leaving Susanna.
No, I think it's like a decade.
It's whatever it was. Time. It's a long time. Yeah. It is more than a few months. And it's tough, because from one point I'm like, that is not okay. But from the other point, it's like, it's tough, because what he is doing is wrong. But also, on this point of Susanna's character being a little chaotic and really, kind of all over the place. And
she doesn't take action in any form.
Well,
she
but
waits for things.
Not only does she wait, but she opens herself up immediately to her fiance's brother, and it's just, it's like, I'm just trying, I was trying to process this. I'm like, well, he's obviously making bad decisions, but it really feels like he needed healing, and he got some of that healing from being away. But then how can that healing journey be okay if him leaving for it was wrong because he left her?
Right.
But they weren't married, and there was this chaos in him, and she is shown to have quite bad judgment. So, I'm just thinking maybe the issue, and it's not really through a fault of her own, because she was just following her own impulses, but she was just like, oh, well, Brad Pitt's back and I like him a lot. Well, as opposed to she should have left the ranch. And if she leaves the ranch, then Tristan probably leaves earlier, goes on his journey, and is not leaving anybody behind, and that makes his journey okay if he's not leaving anybody. So
I mean, to a point, because he still abandoned his dad and his brother, right? And the ranch falls into disrepair.
There
and
is
he
that
goes out.
there's that narration while they're still gone in the war, and it says she was gonna leave, and then Anthony Hopkins. There was a bad winter that came in, and so Anthony Hopkins kind of demands the wrong word. He insists
She
stays
stays.
still.
she stay through the winter, and that's when Tristan comes back
yeah.
From the war.
from the war. Because remember, Alfred gets injured, so he comes back earlier.
Yes.
Tristan doesn't come back right away because he's first processing time.
Right.
Initial-
Because
you know,
he comes back late.
Because
the
his first coping mechanism
makes-
is to scalp Germans.
So
And then he runs off to what?
Brad
It's
Pitt
London,
makes like
right?
at least 3 grand entrances in this movie.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, that would be the second one. And yeah, so they did kind of set that up where like she should have left. She was going to leave.
Yeah.
Like a lot of it is like fate, like you're
Yeah.
saying in the
circumstance
type of story.
or
This is
strange.
like just, but there was a big storm, and Anthony Hopkins insists she stay. You know, worried about her traveling. So, and then Tristan shows up. They didn't know when he was coming back, and as fate would have it,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Well-
timing was what it was.
And I think the contrast too, I want to kind of look at as well as Susanna's character and Isabel too's. I love this, and I didn't even get this, so I'm glad you brought it up. Was his relationship with the two of them and what they did within him are very different, right? Because it's like Susanna, he wouldn't even look at, and yes, there was passion, but there was nothing really sustainable between the two of them. Versus Isabel too, who's confident, knows who she is, has an understanding of what she values and how she wants to do life, and go through
She
that.
can tame the bear.
She can tame that, right? But it's like, and I think there's something to be said. You could take that parallel to a lot of people's choices these days when they go into a relationship and they're like, you know, whether it's sexual or otherwise, they're like, I feel all of these crazy emotions. And so it's like, this must be the person. But sometimes it's not that person that is the best person for you, because just as quickly as those emotions come on, they can also potentially go away. This isn't true for everyone, but Isabel too is more of this steady, slow, methodical, like, I'm in this for it. I know who I am, and I'm not defined by who I'm going to get married. She's like, I'm fine by myself, but I happen to also kind of want to marry you. And so it's a very different set of women that Tristan engages with, right? And I think that's very interesting as a juxtaposition against the two, despite, you know, Susanna's choices about maybe hanging out for a decade longer than she should have, waiting for Brad to come back. But like,
And no,
they're
and
very
that's
different.
the other thing is Susanna makes these poor decisions. She does not respect and value herself, you know, in that way. She just, Brad Pitt immediately gets back. She immediately starts a relationship with him. And then when he leaves and he's gone a lot longer than 3 or 4 months, she just stays and she's like, I'll wait for you forever. And that's not very, you know, valuing herself. That she's not giving herself, she's not defining herself by who she is. She's defining herself as I need this person, you know, and I'll wait for them forever, which is not really, it's not very healthy. It doesn't seem healthy as
Her
opposed to
happiness is in another person.
yeah, which is very dangerous. Never trust other people to make you happy because people are disappointing.
Yes.
But Isabel too is very strong-willed, and you know, part of it is probably that he's healed and that he's in a different place, but also she is a little bit, you know, tougher and she won't let him get away with things, but she also does let him get away with something. And it leads to her death.
The moonshine
The
operation.
moonshine
Is that what we're talking
operation.
about?
Yes.
Did
And-
she care about that though?
Well, and that's what's tough is I, you know, that was a lot. There's a lot of dynamics in that situation. It's a complicated situation, but at the end of the day, he put his family at risk, and then his family was harmed because of what he was doing. And you know, does she care? I don't think she cared that he was breaking the law, but I do think she would care that he was putting the family in harm's way. You know, and it's up to him to protect the family. And we see 2.5 times maybe where Brad Pitt fails to protect his family, maybe more, where
He doesn't have a great track record.
no, because first, and look, the Samuel thing, his younger brother dying isn't really his fault, but he goes to protect. And so even though it's not really his fault, if he goes as his mission is to protect his younger brother and his younger brother dies, he still failed his mission, even though it's not really fully his fault. And then when he leaves, he doesn't protect the woman that he was having a relationship with and you know, hopefully loved. He's not protecting his father. He's not protecting his family in that way. And then he does not protect his wife and family very well by moonshining, and then he's threatened. And then he just kind of keeps doing it, which I feel is like the worst option. I was like, oh, he got threatened. He's going to go right back at these guys. Nope. He just keeps moonshining and gets his family in trouble. And then he doesn't really protect Susanna, and Susanna ends up committing suicide. And that's not that one. That last one isn't really fully his fault, but he also made some bad decisions there, which help exacerbate the issue that's already there. And so I do think that there is that knock on him, and that's part of the reason why he is the rock that others are shattered upon, is because his decision-making is what is leading to these difficult situations. It's leading to this loss and this pain. It's his fault for putting his family in these situations, and I know that I have a wife, but I do not have kids. Jesse does not yet have kids,
or a wife,
yes. And then Chase is the only one of us, with a wife and kids. What is your perspective as a father on that situation where he's running moonshine? And frankly, I don't think anybody in the world cares that he was breaking that law.
No,
but he was putting his family in danger.
In that,
especially after the threat, right?
He did in that very specific situation, yeah, because you see them threaten him. They catch him doing it like at night, but he's by himself. He's making like a late night delivery. And then the next scene, there's like a big kind of fair going on in like downtown Helena.
Country social.
Kind of, yeah. And, he brings his family there. They drive out and they're hanging out. He sees his brother who he hasn't seen in a while. And it's actually been a few years since he's come back at that point because he has 2 kids. Mm-hmm. His oldest son is like probably 3.
Yeah. And
Alfred and Susanna hadn't even seen them yet.
Met the kids, right?
Yeah. Well, they hadn't even. I mean,
he goes and meets Susanna when he first gets back. But then look, he has to fall in love, get married to Isabel
have
too,
kids, yeah.
have kids, and that kid's 3 years old.
So and they have another kid that's maybe 6 to 8 months.
So that's got to be at least 4 or 5 years.
I would say 3 or 4. Yeah. Okay, so it's been this guy, and so anyway. And they're doing that, and then as they're leaving, he goes and he like delivers a little like crate of whiskey or whatever, shine, and
in broad daylight.
In broad daylight,
not even subtle.
He had just seen that Irish guy that threatened him.
Yeah,
and so that was a mistake. Like that's something like you said, I wouldn't fault anyone moonshining back then. Like I get it, and it was just like a poor choice of tactics.
Mm-hmm. Well,
don't do that. Like you previously made, you're doing this at night, kind of clandestine, and then you just do it in broad daylight right in front of the same guy who just threatened you with violence. So probably, yeah.
My counter argument, devil's advocate in this is the moonshining operation was started because cattle prices had dropped so drastically. The ranch was basically had no money, right? So the moonshine operation was started initially to save the ranch, which you could argue was him attempting to provide for his family because that was the only way to
But neither of us are criticizing him being in the moonshine business. I don't have any issue.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
I think at this point, 100 years after Prohibition...
But would you have expected him to not moonshine after the threat of violence, even if he couldn't afford to pay
I'm saying his tactical choice
of doing it in broad daylight
with his family, like just go to the thing, come back later or whatever. Like don't do it with your family when they have to ride back like that. Like you don't put your wife and kids.
The idea of I have been threatened by a gang with violence, therefore I will do the thing they told me not to with my entire family. Yeah. Okay. That's we're picking up.
That's where we're picking up.
That's the point where I'm like, man, that's just like that's totally on him. Like
that is on him.
The gang that comes after, and his wife is not purposefully killed, but they're driving down.
It's actually a cop that kills her.
Yeah, it's a dirt. They show up with the dirty cops to kind of. To rough him up a little bit, and his family's there, and a cop shoots a gun into the air, and whether it's a ricochet or whatever it may be, his wife gets, unluckily, or by fate or whatever you want to call it, gets hit in the heart and dies immediately. And it's just like he's the one who put them in that situation. Yes, the cop is the one who was shooting off his Tommy gun when he should not have been. The gang is the one who went out there to strong arm him. They're all technically committing, I think, a felony is what it was with smuggling. Like, I get all that. But the issue, the core issue is that he put his family in the line of fire. Yeah. And that's what I think that's what I'm talking about. Look, if he wants to keep trying to do it at night, and again, when it's Brad Pitt, who's this wild man the entire time.
You would expect nothing less.
Yeah, well, I'm just like, well, what I was like is like, okay, these Irish guys come, over from Ireland. They're in Helena, Montana, threatening the wild man who's grown up here. He's going to go right back at him. They're just all going to end up dead. He's going to take their scalps. And instead of him doing anything when he's threatened, he just does it with his family in broad daylight. Yeah. That's the issue.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that is just like, that is top notch, just not a smart move.
So moving on from that point, he does basically go on a revenge trip. Like, he goes full John Wick on them and basically goes out and gets them all murdered.
Shoves the guy into a pitchfork.
But he only murders two guys. They only murder, what, two guys? How many more
they do
guys?
the cop,
but that's
one stab goes out.
That's Isabel 2's
He goes
dad.
after, the younger Irish brother. There's, two Irish guys that are brothers. He goes after
the
one
O'Bannons.
The O'Bannons. He kills the one in, the warehouse.
Yes.
And then Isabel 2's father, and I love this scene because there is some cool weaponry in this movie that I like. Mm-hmm. First of all, he has a sweet antler Bowie knife that's just awesome throughout the whole movie, and he does work with it. Mm-hmm. And then in this scene where Isabel 2's father basically snipes this guy's car and then shoots him, I think he's using a Shiloh Sharps, and it would have been something like a 45-70, but maybe something a little bit bigger. And it's like a breech action loader, so you pull. It doesn't break like a shotgun, but you pull the breech open. It's like a trap door. Yeah. Really cool rifles, and it's like Quigley Down Under, kind of similar.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
If you're a cop and you have accidentally killed somebody's wife and somebody's daughter who work out on a ranch and have weapons, and your car just stops working and you get out and get hit, should you slowly stand up? Because that scene to me was almost funny.
You think he got hit by a rock or something? And that really hurt.
He gets hit the first time. His car stops working. Get it? It's the 20s. That may happen on a road.
And he's also shooting at him from about, I would guess around 500-600 yards. Which is a pretty nice shot.
Which is a great shot.
3 times.
But he gets hit, and then he's like, oh, I got hit, and just slowly stands up. I'm like, man, I feel like the second you get shot, you dive for cover. Unless he was just so dazed by the first one. I thought that scene was kind of funny.
That guy got walloped by a pretty big slug. That thing's probably between 250 to 300 grain.
That's a lot.
Slug, I think. I could be totally off.
He's
but
not
I think
thinking.
For those that don't speak in terms of grains and bullets, we're just going to say that's a big one. That is a lot.
It's a bullet weight. And on that, it's a cartridge that would be probably yay big, tall, the entire cartridge. And
so for you audio only people.
For people who are not listening,
sorry, we got cameras in front of us, so I naturally but 3.5 inches maybe in length if it's a 45-70, and if it's a 5100 or something, which was another one back then, it'd been a little longer, you'd see about, ½ inch, 3/4 inch of a slug popping out, but under that brass neck, that bullet's probably about 1.5 inches long. So it's just a big fat piece of lead. Just
again, for those of you not well versed in the language of firearms, it's a very big bullet.
Yeah, big bullet. Another cool, since we're on this topic, at the end when Anthony Hopkins hobbles out in his amazing either grizzly or buffalo hide coat that he's wearing the second last third of the movie. When Brad Pitt comes back from his very long trip, he gives him this rifle that he can't really put together because his stroke doesn't really allow him much tactile, motor skills.
Dexterity.
The dexterity needed to assemble it, but he does eventually get it because they come to kill Brad Pitt after they kill these two guys, and Anthony Hopkins kind of walks out. It's my favorite scene because they're telling Brad Pitt they're basically gonna go take him and kill him, and then Anthony Hopkins comes and he's like, "What's going on here?" And then he just opens his coat and he whips up this thing. And most people probably think this is a shotgun because it looks like a double barrel shotgun.
Oh, is it? I definitely thought it was a shotgun.
It's not. I guarantee. So you see a rifle like this earlier when it shows him hunting in Africa. So this is probably an elephant gun that he got in Africa because this shotgun, it's kind of like this exotic weapon he brings, and they kind of allude to it, and it's probably like somewhere between a 50 or 60 caliber like nitro, and they're even bigger than the one the guy shot the cop with. They're these like
very, very large bullets.
If you wanna look more into this, go on YouTube and type in like 700 Nitro Express fails, and you will see videos of people shooting these kinds of rounds and like getting absolutely like thrown back into walls and stuff
Because
by
of how
these,
powerful it is.
they're for shooting elephants. And he was out in Africa shooting all this game, and you see him walking with one of those guns on his shoulder, and you can see the bandolier across his chest with all the slugs, and you'll see they're like the width of a shotgun shell. That's why it looks like a shotgun, but it's actually a brass.
It's just a massive rifle.
It's a massive rifle
Okay.
round.
Okay.
And very cool.
And then Anthony just like
and
hip
he
shoots
blasts
it and
that
does
guy
the-
with
So
it.
when
Yeah.
that guy like flies back, it's pretty realistic because he just.
I don't know. I've never had the
I mean, I feel
shouldn't
like
say
he's-
pleasure, but I've never had the experience of doing
shooting
that,
one of those.
of shooting that into organic matter like that, and seeing what happens.
But the power of if
we
you
could get
attune
one
the
and-
fail, if you attune the fail, or if you take the distance they fly when they fail shooting, and you apply that to the opposite end, it's probably fairly.
I mean, if we
accurate.
could get a hold of one of these and maybe like a 200-pound pig, I'm down to try.
Okay.
We'll have to get some sponsors. We'll get a show budget. That's how we'll
Yes,
do
we need to. We'll have a secondary channel where we just like put movie scenarios to the test to find out. how
Point
they work
being,
out.
very cool weapons in this movie.
it. Okay. I love it.
I really enjoyed the actor who played One Stab, the elder Indian gentleman. His narration, he's almost always singing, or he's doing rites over, or teaching them how to use the land. My father's very into Native American spirituality and stuff like that, so it's just very interesting to see this portrayed. I don't know how accurate it is. I have not done my research on this particular tribe that's represented here, but I just think that actor plays it very well. Like he seems, I don't know if he's authentically Native American or had grown up in that lifestyle that he could put input into the movie, but it didn't feel as Hollywood faked as some other movies have, as far as the way he interpreted different things and some of the philosophies he brings forth that are maybe less intuitive to an American that he talks about.
Brad Pitt says what tribe he's from right before he beats the piss out of that bartender who won't serve him a beer.
Oh yeah,
He's like, this is One Stab, and he like gives this like speech about who he is, what
Right.
tribe he's from. I forgot about that scene. That's kind of like another thing I was thinking about with that like subverting society kind of theme that their family does. Like they have this Indian living with them. They treat him as an equal. They bring him in
When the rest
public
of the world's
when the rest
not
of the world
treating him.
wouldn't, you know.
and he just beats the tar out of that bartender, just like
To the
just
dismay of-
just out of nowhere, because you're not expecting it, and then all of a sudden Brad Pitt just literally flies over the top of this bar and just starts beating the hell out of this bartender, which is again subverting expectations, like Chase said. So, all right, well, anything else we want to talk about, or do we want to give our stake evaluations, our USDA grades on this movie? Anything else anybody wanted to mention, bring up?
Yeah, I think the last little thing I'd like to say is, in the classic way of being a tragedy, a tragic story, the climax, the win for him is when these guys show up to kill him for killing one of the O'Bannon brothers. The second O'Bannon brother shows up with two dirty cops to kill him. And is the sheriff there? The sheriff that's been in the
Yes.
movie
I
for a
think
while?
so.
Yeah.
So that sheriff who's kind of dirty and, is a representation of kind of government corruption for a little bit. Like he's there too. So there's one dirty cop, one dirty sheriff, and then the O'Bannon brother.
And Alfred, Alfred.
Well, no, that's what I was going to say.
No, but I mean,
is-
Alfred is also they're one of their cohorts at this point. Like that's why he hasn't seen his father in so long. He brings all these men to his father's house, expecting a blessing for him to run for Senate. And to his credit, Anthony Hopkins looks at him and he's like, "And what do these men want in return?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Are you telling me you haven't asked what they want? Do you know nothing about the government and what these men want something from you and you
Yeah.
don't even see it?" He's like, "There's no." What does he say?
He basically he says, no, they just see the greatness of my merits or whatever.
It-
right?
what
Like he's
Anthony Hopkins says something like what government, like the attributes like the government doesn't have, like, and then Alfred's like, well, then it is my duty to bring these attributes to the government. And it's like, and he goes, thank you for your blessing. And that's the last time they see each other for a long time. And so he's the reason the Volstead Act passes. He's the reason that they have this kind of monopoly on like the liquor distribution there. And these characters are in throughout the movie. They introduce them earlier, and then you see them meet Alfred. You see him rise to power, and they're always right there with him. And now he's kind of caught in it. He's the one that comes and says, after Tristan beats that cop for accidentally shooting his wife, he comes to the funeral, and then right after the funeral says, you're going to have to turn yourself in because that cop was hurt pretty bad. And Tristan's like,
what?
Killed my wife.
Killed the guy. He's like, the man who killed my wife. And Alfred's like, well,
he was reprimanded.
And so you see Alfred is like, he's living in this like moral limbo of like, he's caught up in all this too. And I know what you're getting at.
Well,
I just wanted to throw that in because we kind of,
no, you're right. And it sets up the scene for at the end, that double barrel rifle. There's 3 bad guys and there's 2 barrels.
Yep.
And so Anthony Hopkins takes out 2.
Yeah.
And then right before, it's a great scene because I think it's the sheriff who's still alive, raises up his gun to shoot Anthony Hopkins. Tristan jumps in front of Anthony Hopkins, and you hear a gunshot, and it's from Alfred shooting the sheriff.
Yep.
I shot the sheriff, But
that's his redemption arc.
And that's his redemption arc. And you see that I think Alfred he's a true believer. Samuel is shown as the idealist who's naive, but then it's really Alfred who's the idealist and naive. And Alfred goes on this arc. But even within all this great victory where Alfred is redeemed, from being a rule follower who's an idealist and naive to understanding what's really happening and standing up for his family, and Tristan, redeeming himself by he's willing to sacrifice himself for his father and everything. Even after all that, it's tragic because Alfred says they're going to think you did this, which is true. They're going to think that Tristan is the one who killed all 3 of them. He's like, and they're going to come after you. And so Tristan, he's sorrowful and he says, well, take care of my kids. And he has to go off and he lives his life on the run and moving, and he gets to see his kids and grandkids and everything. But
the way they narrate the end makes it seem like he probably wasn't doing that forever, but you don't know.
But I'm sure that he wasn't able to just like put down roots with them as much, and he had to leave for at least a little bit. And so there is still
like
some of that
one
American
of the biggest tragedies in the whole movie when thinking of having children and.
No, and that's why it is truly tragic. And, there's still a little bit of that American, happiness at the end where he lives a long, good life and everything and gets to see his kids and their kids and everything. But it still is, it's also tragic that he doesn't get to just purely raise his kids because he's going to be on the run for years. The U.S. government, especially back then, did not forget you killing a sheriff. So.
Absolutely. Well, let's finish up with our grading. What's your grade? What's your steak for this movie?
I'm gonna go with a steak that I don't even eat that much, but I do enjoy it when I do, and that's prime rib.
Okay.
And it's good. It's a big steak usually. It's large and it's usually like get it somewhere fancier usually, but it's pretty good quality. It's like always enjoyable. It's not my favorite steak in the world, but I really like it. So that's what I'll give it. I'll give it a prime rib.
Prime rib. Zach?
This show makes me realize I need to study on steak more.
We're gonna run out. We're gonna have to. It's okay.
Yeah, it's all good. Probably like a good tri-tip. Something that it's tasty. It's got some good meat. You grill it right. You cook it right. It's a good movie. It's not my favorite kind of movie, but they do a good job. It's a beautiful, beautiful shots. It's a beautiful landscape. The actors do a good job, other than Brad Pitt being the most hilarious crier I've ever seen. And so it's overall, it's a really good movie. It's a good story, and I liked it. So yeah, something like a good tri-tip, something that if you were to give me any steak in the world, I probably would not choose a tri-tip, but it's a good steak, and I like it.
Anytime a movie makes you like want to do something, even though it's a tragic movie that's kind of like a redeeming quality, like what, you watch this and you're like, man, I want to live on a ranch in Montana. I want to work outside like a cowboy all day and then put on a 3-piece suit to eat dinner at night, which for some reason Anthony Hopkins and they all do. They get like dressed up like they're in downtown New York to eat dinner on their ranch. So yeah, it's the vibes of this movie that help kind of redeem it from the tragic. Because there's other movies that have like similar, kind of tragic lines through them, and you get done and it's just kind of like it's kind of a downer. I don't think I'd watch that again. But I keep coming back to Legends of the Fall. I've been watching this movie, regularly since like 2005.
I mean, I would kind of go with, I actually did just Google different steak types because I feel like I need to have some things. And I mean, honestly, I would kind of almost go with just like a tri-tip sirloin, something like that, like Zach said, where it's like just 8 ounces. It's got some good like grill marks on it. It's not anything fancy, but it's something that, like Chase said, you can keep coming back to it. It's not like you're never going to not at least enjoy it a little bit. It's an older style movie. I mean, it's obviously a 90s movie.
Oh, it's definitely a 90s movie.
But it's like, yeah, you get those vibes of like, oh, it could be cool to live out. I mean, I think that's what is evoked in a lot of people that are watching like Yellowstone. Or
this is the Yellowstone of the 90s in a way.
It's like, this could be you if you wanted to go and do this. Like, you could go live out on a ranch and do the things, right? And it's like, I think just having that kind of old, reliable. I mean, it even comes back to kind of that old American value of us living out here in the West. It's like, this is kind of the stuff that built this area, whether these guys out on ranches just working the land doing the stuff. So I think, just a solid sirloin steak, just it's nothing fancy, but it's doing its good work and you can always enjoy it. So with that is today's episode. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We've been trying to incorporate a newer movie and an older movie, and so next podcast we'll probably do something newer. We all went and saw Bullet Train. I don't know if we want to do that one, but it's another Brad Pitt. We could just double tap the Brad Pitt.
We could do Buzz Lightyear.
Buzz Lightyear.
It's not good.
We have
at
least one other Brad Pitt title that I'm thinking of that's going to come up at some point too. So this guy's going to come back.
Brad will be around. So if you guys have suggestions on movies you'd like us to review, leave them in the comments or in the reviews on Apple Podcast if you're doing that, or if you're watching on YouTube, leave them in the YouTube comments. We'd love to hear what you'd love to hear our takes on, for better or worse. But thank you guys so much for joining us on the Real Steak Podcast, and we'll see you next time.